At 100 years old, Dick Van Dyke doesn't just sit quietly in reflection. He speaks, and when he does, the world listens. But what he said recently about Rob Reiner wasn't praise. It wasn't nostalgia. It was contempt, raw and unfiltered. Imagine a man whose smile lit up countless living rooms, whose laughter defined generations, calling one of Hollywood's most revered figures a fucking idiot. That's right. At 100, Dick Van Dyke leveled a truth that no one dared voice for decades. And suddenly, the glamorous veneer of Hollywood perfection cracked in front of our eyes. But what drove Van Dyke to this point? What dark undercurrents simmered beneath the smiles, the awards, the standing ovations? And why does it matter now, as the Reiner family faces a tragedy that's as shocking as it is incomprehensible? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Picture this: Brentwood, a wealthy Los Angeles neighborhood, quiet and sun-drenched. But behind the manicured lawns and towering gates, a horror story unfolded. Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death in their $13.5 million estate. Their son, Nick, 32, was arrested that very night. The world recoiled at the news. But even amidst the chaos of crime and investigation, there's a story no one has truly dared to tell. The story of Hollywood, of ambition, of egos clashing across decades, and of a legendary actor finally revealing what he thought of one of the industry's golden boys. Dick Van Dyke's words are not just gossip. They are the culmination of decades of observation, professional rivalry, and personal disappointment. He had watched Rob Reiner rise, charm, and manipulate his way into the spotlight. And yet, behind every joke, behind every classic film, Van Dyke saw arrogance, cruelty, and a kind of shallow brilliance that infuriated him. You might ask yourself, why now? Why reveal it at 100? After a lifetime of smiling politely at cameras, attending award shows, and shaking hands with colleagues. Maybe it's because the timing is unavoidable. Maybe the recent Reiner tragedy made it impossible to stay silent. Or perhaps, after a century of living, Van Dyke realized that some truths demand to be spoken, even if they burn bridges long after everyone else has forgotten them. Let's take a step back. Rob Reiner has been an icon, a filmmaker, an actor, a public figure whose charm and wit have been celebrated for decades. He's directed movies that made millions laugh, cry, and think. His public persona is impeccable, polished like the leather of a luxury car. And yet, behind the cameras, the story is different. Hollywood insiders have whispered about his manipulation, his ego, and the subtle ways he exerted control over those around him. Van Dyke, who knows this world intimately, witnessed it firsthand. And at 100, with nothing left to prove in the weight of truth pressing upon him, he finally let the world in on what he's known all along. The irony is almost Shakespearean. A man like Van Dyke, whose career thrived on charm and kindness, harboring decades of unspoken disdain. A man like Reiner, who cultivated an image of trustworthiness and geniality, now at the center of a real-life horror story. The contrast is staggering. How did we get here? How did admiration turn to contempt? How did family bonds break under pressures we can barely understand? And most importantly, what does Van Dyke's revelation tell us about the darker side of Hollywood? The side hidden behind smiles, awards, and interviews? We need to consider context. The Reiner family tragedy didn't happen in isolation. The dynamics of fame, privilege, mental health, and secrecy all collided in a way that few could predict. Reports suggest that their daughter, Romy, 27, discovered the bodies. She allegedly told police about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. That family member is Nick Reiner, who now faces first-degree murder charges. The media coverage has been relentless, dissecting every statement, every photograph, every Instagram post. Yet, even amid the headlines, one angle remains largely unexplored: the way personality clashes, family dysfunction, and decades of Hollywood rivalry intersect in ways that are sometimes deadly, sometimes humiliating, and sometimes astonishingly revealing. Van Dyke's statement isn't just about contempt. It's about recognition. He sees patterns. He sees how charm can mask cruelty. He sees how power can be used to manipulate. And perhaps, Most importantly, he sees the consequences when those lessons are ignored. He knew Reiner. He worked alongside him. He observed the subtle, often cruel, ways that Reiner's personality influenced projects, people, and outcomes. He saw the arrogance, the dismissiveness, and the silent battles that raged in meetings, on sets, and in private offices. And now, looking at the Reiner family tragedy, he recognizes the human cost of unchecked behavior, the ways in which private flaws can ripple outward into catastrophic consequences. Think about that for a moment. A man whose humor and grace defined an era sees the decay of character in a man celebrated for decades. And he doesn't just notice it, he names it. He calls it for what it is. A fucking idiot. There's no sugarcoating, no attempt to be diplomatic, no concern for Hollywood etiquette. Just raw truth, served with decades of accumulated frustration. And that truth matters, because it reframes how we see not just Rob Reiner, but the very culture of Hollywood. It asks us, how many reputations are carefully curated facades hiding deep fractures? How many personal vendettas and jealousies simmer quietly behind the scenes, unspoken, until something snaps? Now, I can hear you asking, but why is this story relevant to the Reiner tragedy? The answer is simple. Context is everything. To understand a family torn apart, to understand the pressures that can drive people to extreme actions, we must examine the personalities, the relationships, and the histories that shaped them. Van Dyke's revelation offers a lens, a way to interpret not just one family's disaster, but a broader pattern of human behavior magnified by fame, wealth, and expectation. When we peel back the layers, we see the interplay of admiration and disdain, of mentorship and betrayal, of charm and manipulation. And those layers are not just Hollywood anecdotes, they are human truths. Consider this. For decades, the public adored Reiner. His films, his interviews, his awards, they created an image of the consummate professional, the beloved filmmaker, the trusted colleague. But Van Dyke's words challenge that narrative. They force us to question the gap between appearance and reality. And in the wake of a shocking murder, that gap becomes even more significant. Because it's in the spaces between what is shown and what is hidden that tragedy often takes root. Family members misjudged, colleagues manipulated, opportunities exploited. All of it intertwines with the public persona to create consequences that no one could anticipate. And yet, even as we grapple with Van Dyke's revelation, there is curiosity, there is tension, there is that irresistible urge to understand more. What exactly happened between these two Hollywood icons? What incidents, what slights, what professional betrayals fueled decades of disdain? How did those experiences shape their interactions, both public and private? And most importantly, how did they echo into the lives of the Reiner family, influencing choices, relationships, and perhaps even contributing, indirectly or directly, to the events in Brentwood that shocked the world? Here's what we know. Van Dyke has always been a man of observation. His charm and humor are not superficial. They are tools for navigating a world where appearances matter more than truth. He has seen brilliance and mediocrity, kindness and cruelty, in equal measure. And when he speaks, he distills experience into clarity. His words about Reiner are not casual gossip. They are a synthesis of decades of observation, reflection, and perhaps frustration. He identifies character flaws with precision, and in doing so, he reveals the often hidden dynamics of Hollywood culture, the tension between ego and talent, between public image and private conduct, between affection and contempt. So, as we step into this story, we are not merely recounting gossip or sensationalizing tragedy. We are examining a complex web of relationships, choices, and consequences. We are looking at the intersection of fame, family, and human nature. We are confronting the uncomfortable reality that brilliance and arrogance often coexist, that charm can conceal cruelty, and that admiration can mask contempt. And as Van Dyke's revelation makes clear, sometimes it takes a century of perspective to finally call it like it is. At first glance, Dick Van Dyke seems impossible to dislike. The twinkle in his eye, that iconic grin, the physical comedy that made him a household name. He is the embodiment of charm. He dances. He sings. He makes people laugh until they forget their own troubles. But what if I told you that behind that smile, behind the laughter, was a man who saw the world with razor-sharp clarity, a man who had opinions so strong he kept them to himself for decades, until now. And among the targets of that scrutiny was none other than Rob Reiner. It's almost poetic. Van Dyke's entire career has been built on warmth and approachability. Mary Poppins, The Dick Van Dyke Show, countless films, he was America's sweetheart. And yet, the very qualities that made him beloved were the same qualities that made him intolerant of superficiality and pretense. He could sense it, recognize it, and, for years, endure it silently. Hollywood is a world of glittering facades. It's a place where image often outweighs substance. And Van Dyke, despite his jovial exterior, had an uncanny ability to see through the smoke and mirrors. Early in his career, Van Dyke faced the typical trials of an actor trying to break into Hollywood. He auditioned endlessly, faced rejection after rejection, and yet never lost his sense of humor. That resilience was coupled with an integrity that set him apart from the crowd. Unlike others, he refused to play the game of deception, manipulation, and ego inflation. He believed in talent, in hard work, in being authentic. And this is where the seeds of his contempt for Reiner began to grow. Because Reiner, from Van Dyke's perspective, represented everything he had worked to avoid. Charm used as a weapon, influence leveraged to manipulate outcomes, an ego that masqueraded as charisma. In countless meetings, on countless sets, Van Dyke observed Reiner's subtle tactics. The way he could charm producers, the way he could undermine colleagues without leaving a trace, the way he could bend situations to his advantage while appearing congenial. Van Dyke didn't just notice these things, he cataloged them. He understood their implications, and he quietly loathed it. But Van Dyke wasn't a man to lash out publicly. That wasn't his style. Instead, he used humor, observation, and timing. He navigated the same rooms, the same contracts, the same parties, and maintained a professional front. He laughed when he needed to. He smiled when cameras were rolling. He charmed the media and the public, all while internally keeping score. And for decades, he waited for the right moment to speak. Waited until age and reflection gave him the freedom to tell the truth without fear of career repercussions. What makes Van Dyke so fascinating isn't just his talent, it's his intellect. He reads people like books. He senses dishonesty before anyone else notices. He understands motives, subtle or overt, and interprets them with clarity few possess. And Rob Reiner, despite, or perhaps because of, his own brilliance, could not hide from Van Dyke. Every self-serving gesture, every manipulative maneuver, every carefully crafted image was immediately transparent to him. That's why, when Van Dyke finally spoke, his words carried weight. They weren't idle opinions. They were conclusions drawn from decades of observation. But here's the twist. While Van Dyke's contempt was deeply personal, it wasn't petty. It wasn't about small grudges or fleeting jealousy. It was about principles, integrity. The idea that talent should be respected, not exploited. That professionalism should be honored, not leveraged for personal gain. And in Van Dyke's eyes, Reiner repeatedly violated these principles. Each violation chipped away at any respect Van Dyke may have once held. And over time, the disdain grew so profound that it could no longer be contained. You might ask, what specific incidents fueled this animosity? The details are fascinating, bizarre, and occasionally humorous. There were meetings where Reiner took credit for ideas that weren't his. There were awards ceremonies where Van Dyke watched Reiner charm producers into greenlighting mediocre projects. There were interviews where Van Dyke observed Reiner's subtle digs at colleagues, masked with politeness, that would leave reputations tarnished in whispers. Each incident alone might seem minor, but when compiled over decades, the pattern became undeniable. And it wasn't just the professional behavior that disgusted Van Dyke. It was the moral and ethical compromises that accompanied it. Van Dyke is a man who values character above all else. He believes that how you treat people behind closed doors matters as much as what you accomplish in public. And by this standard, Reiner repeatedly failed. The more Van Dyke witnessed, the more he understood how Reiner's charm and public persona were armor, hiding insecurity, ambition, and a willingness to manipulate. He saw the cracks in the facade. He recognized the consequences of unchecked ego. And over time, This recognition transformed admiration into contempt. Yet Van Dyke is not just a critic. He is also a storyteller. He knows that context, humor, and narrative matter. That's why his eventual revelation about Reiner wasn't delivered as a cold, analytical critique. It was a performance, a confession, a story laced with humor, irony, and undeniable truth. He chose words that stung, words that shocked, words that demanded attention. And he knew, instinctively, that the story would resonate far beyond Hollywood insiders. It would reach anyone who has ever dealt with duplicity, manipulation, or betrayal. And now, with Reiner's family facing an unimaginable tragedy, Van Dyke's words take on a new significance. They are no longer just Hollywood gossip. They are a lens through which we can examine personality, behavior, and consequence. How does a man who is outwardly charming end up creating chaos around him? How do decades of subtle manipulation and self-interest ripple into family life, professional environments, and public perception? Van Dyke doesn't just ask these questions. He provides answers through the clarity of his observation. Think about the stakes. We are dealing with a man whose actions, reputation, and choices have influenced countless lives. A man whose charm could open doors and whose ego could close them just as quickly. And we are seeing, in the Reiner tragedy, what can happen when public persona and private behavior collide with catastrophic results. Van Dyke, in his characteristic frankness, doesn't hold back. He names the flaws, articulates the patterns, and delivers a verdict shaped by experience. A fucking idiot. Short, blunt, and devastatingly precise. But even as he delivers this condemnation, there is nuance. Van Dyke doesn't hate Reiner out of malice. He hates what he sees as wasted potential, misused talent, and a disregard for integrity. He mourns what could have been, a more honorable, more conscientious figure in Hollywood. And he warns us, implicitly, that charm and success are not measures of character. That brilliance can be paired with arrogance. That admiration can blind us to reality. And, most importantly, that understanding human behavior requires both observation and honesty. Van Dyke's life, of course, adds weight to everything he says. He has lived through the evolution of Hollywood, witnessed its transformations, endured its scandals, and survived its ruthless competition. He has seen careers rise and fall, reputations made and destroyed, friendships forged and broken. And in all of it, he has maintained a moral compass, a sense of humor, and an ability to see through pretense. Which is why, when he points at Reiner and calls him a fucking idiot, the words carry authority. They are not a whim. They are a distillation of decades of insight. We cannot ignore the timing either. At 100, Van Dyke is beyond the pressures of career advancement, beyond the expectations of Hollywood approval. He can speak with freedom, clarity, and courage. And he chooses to speak now, in a moment when Hollywood glamour collides with human tragedy. The Reiner family murders are shocking, yes, but Van Dyke's revelation reframes them. It asks us to consider personality, influence, and consequence. It challenges us to look past appearances and question the dynamics that shape not just careers, but lives and even deaths. So as we move forward, it's essential to keep one question in mind. How does one man's charm hide another man's flaws? How does brilliance coexist with manipulation? And how do the consequences of these personality clashes manifest, sometimes in ways that are heartbreaking, horrifying, and unavoidable? Van Dyke has given us a glimpse. He has set the stage. And the story that unfolds is one that challenges every assumption we might have had about Hollywood, about families, and about human behavior itself. But what comes next, the interactions, the incidents, the choices that led to both personal and family devastation, will reveal just how far the gap between public image and private reality can stretch. And when you hear it, you'll understand why Van Dyke's contempt was not only justified, but inevitable. The story of Dick Van Dyke's observations and the Reiner family's tragedy is only beginning. And what comes next will change everything you think you know about Hollywood, about personality, and about the dangerous intersections between fame and family. At first glance, Rob Reiner seems like the embodiment of Hollywood success. Golden boy, charismatic, charming, beloved by millions. From his early days on All in the Family to directing blockbuster films like When Harry Met Sally and A Few Good Men, he built a career that many could only dream of. Awards, accolades, fame, respect. And yet, behind the smiling photographs and glowing interviews, there's another story, a darker story, one that Dick Van Dyke has witnessed firsthand, and one that casts a long shadow over the image we've all been conditioned to admire. Think about this. How often do we see the polished public persona and assume it represents the whole truth? For Rob Reiner, the public saw a likable, witty, articulate man, always ready with a clever line or a thoughtful comment on the state of Hollywood or politics. They saw a family man, a loyal friend, a professional at the top of his game. But what Van Dyke and other insiders saw was a man who wielded charm like a weapon, a man who could manipulate situations subtly and efficiently, and a man whose ego often outpaced his talent. The dissonance is striking. On paper, he was golden. Behind the curtain, he could be ruthless. Van Dyke's frustration with Reiner wasn't born from envy alone, it was born from principle. He had spent decades observing how Reiner navigated Hollywood with calculated precision. Each handshake, each smile, each public compliment was carefully measured, a tool to maintain status and influence. The contrast between public image and private reality is staggering. Hollywood is built on perception, but perception doesn't always align with integrity. Reiner's image, a man of humor, warmth, and approachability, was a mask, a carefully curated exterior designed to navigate a world where influence is currency and charm is power. Van Dyke, who built his own career on authenticity and skill, saw right through it. And that made Reiner's success all the more galling. It wasn't that he disliked achievement. It was that he saw it being achieved through manipulation rather than merit, through optics rather than effort. Van Dyke's personal anecdotes about Reiner reveal the subtle ways in which this charm turned corrosive. Meetings that seemed collaborative were often arenas of quiet dominance. Ideas presented as shared visions were frequently co-opted for personal gain. Van Dyke describes how Reiner would offer a compliment to the wrong person at the wrong time, strategically reshaping perceptions of competence and authority. It's a pattern of behavior that is difficult to detect unless you're watching closely, and Van Dyke was. And it wasn't just professional dynamics that revealed Reiner's darker tendencies. Personal interactions, too, told a story. Van Dyke recalls social gatherings where Reiner's wit seemed charming on the surface, but carried a subtle sting beneath. Jokes that cut too close to comfort, praises that served self-interest, and gestures of goodwill that masked strategic advantage. These behaviors, small in isolation, accumulate over decades. They reveal a pattern of egocentricity that, to Van Dyke, couldn't be ignored. It was the same pattern repeated in both public and private life. Charm as armor, manipulation as strategy, ego as fuel. Yet, it's important to note that Reiner's skill as a filmmaker and actor cannot be denied. His work on both sides of the camera demonstrates creativity, vision, and competence. But Van Dyke's critique isn't about ability, it's about character. He sees brilliance intertwined with a willingness to compromise ethics for advantage. And it is this combination that both fascinates and frustrates Van Dyke. How can someone so talented be so morally compromised? How can someone so adored simultaneously inspire admiration and contempt? These are questions that drive the narrative, and they are central to understanding both Reiner's rise and the tragedy that later enveloped his family. The irony deepens when we consider the Hollywood ecosystem itself. Reiner thrives in a system that rewards visibility, charm, and strategic self-promotion. Talent alone is rarely enough. And yet, the very qualities that make him successful, his charisma, his social intelligence, his ability to influence, are the qualities Van Dyke found infuriating precisely because they were divorced from genuine integrity. Van Dyke respected skill, dedication, and authenticity. To see these sidelined by calculated charm was infuriating, almost personally insulting. Moreover, Reiner's public persona as a family man and mentor often masked the private pressures he exerted on those closest to him. Van Dyke hints at a man who could be controlling behind the scenes, who expected loyalty and deference, and who navigated conflicts with a strategic mind rather than an empathetic heart. This pattern, observers note, isn't uncommon in Hollywood, but in Reiner's case, it was amplified by his position, reputation, and access. And for Van Dyke, watching this unfold over decades was both frustrating and enlightening. He could predict behaviors, anticipate manipulations, and see the consequences long before others did. Van Dyke's contempt is also generational. He represents a Hollywood ethic rooted in authenticity, collaboration, and respect for craft. Reiner, by contrast, exemplifies a newer ethos, one where perception can override principle, where charisma can be leveraged for advantage, and where image can sometimes be more influential than integrity. For Van Dyke, this clash wasn't hypothetical. It played out in real time across decades of interactions, collaborations, and industry events. It's why his later declaration, calling Reiner a fucking idiot, resonates so powerfully. It's the judgment of a man who has observed brilliance misapplied, charm weaponized, and principles compromised. And yet, even as Van Dyke critiques Reiner, there's a grudging acknowledgement of his talents. Reiner's successes are undeniable. His films, his acting, his directorial achievements are part of Hollywood history. But in Van Dyke's eyes, talent is not an excuse for ethical lapses. Charisma does not erase manipulation. Success does not absolve deceit. And when we frame the Reiner family tragedy within this context, the stakes become frighteningly clear. The behaviors Van Dyke observed professionally may have echoed within the family, influencing decisions, dynamics, and ultimately contributing to an environment where tragedy could occur. This duality, admiration for skill mixed with contempt for character, forms the crux of Van Dyke's assessment. And it's a lens that forces the audience to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Rob Reiner. The man who entertained millions, who directed award-winning films, who charmed industry insiders, is also a man capable of manipulation, ego-driven decision-making, and ethical compromises. And those contradictions, while fascinating in isolation, take on profound significance when paired with the events in Brentwood, where the Reiner family lives and ultimately meets unimaginable tragedy. So as we explore this story, we must remember this. Public personas are often masks, and charm can be dangerous when divorced from integrity. Van Dyke's observations provide a rare, insider perspective on the subtle ways in which Reiner's personality influenced not just Hollywood, but the people around him, colleagues, collaborators, and ultimately, family. And understanding this context is crucial, because the events that unfolded in Brentwood cannot be fully understood without seeing the patterns that preceded them, patterns that Van Dyke observed with unflinching clarity over decades. But what's most shocking is not just the professional rivalry, the subtle manipulation, or the ethical compromises. It's what happens when these behaviors intersect with family, with mental health challenges, and with unchecked privilege. That intersection, Van Dyke suggests, is where danger lurks. And the story of Rob Reiner, the golden boy turned complicated figure, beloved by the public but deeply flawed in private, is only beginning to reveal its most haunting truths. At 100 years old, Dick Van Dyke could have chosen to speak in vague platitudes. He could have reminisced about Hollywood's golden age, shared humorous anecdotes, and delighted fans with stories of long-forgotten sets. Instead, he chose to speak the truth. And the truth? He hated Rob Reiner. Not in a casual, fleeting way, but in a deep, enduring, bone-deep way that had simmered for decades. A fucking idiot, he said. Short, blunt, devastatingly honest. But what does that really mean? And why, after decades of professionalism and polite smiles, would Van Dyke finally say it aloud? To understand the depth of Van Dyke's contempt, we have to trace the origins of it. Early in their interactions, Reiner impressed most people with his charm, intelligence, and wit. On the surface, he was the ideal colleague, the consummate professional. But Van Dyke, a man whose intuition about character was almost uncanny, quickly recognized something else, something that others either overlooked or chose to ignore. There was arrogance. There was subtle manipulation. There was a pattern of self-interest carefully concealed behind charm. And for Van Dyke, who valued integrity and authenticity above all, it was infuriating. The first time Van Dyke observed what he would later call Reiner's idiocy was not a single event, but a series of moments. Meetings where Reiner took credit for ideas that weren't his. award ceremonies where he charmed producers and peers while quietly undermining colleagues, on-set interactions that seemed collaborative but were actually exercises in control. To the untrained eye, these moments looked harmless, polite competition, even. But Van Dyke, watching closely, saw the pattern. And patterns, he knew, revealed character. Van Dyke's hatred was not born of petty jealousy. He could have ignored Reiner, passed by in silence, and continued his career unaffected. But he didn't, because it wasn't about Reiner's talent. It was about how he used it. Talent without principle, Van Dyke believed, is dangerous. It's wasted potential, and worse, it can inflict real harm on others. And the harm wasn't hypothetical. He saw how Reiner's actions affected colleagues, projects, and even friends. Behind every seemingly innocuous smile or compliment, there was calculation, an intent to advance self-interest at the expense of others. Over the years, Van Dyke collected these observations like pieces of a puzzle. Each interaction added another layer to his understanding of Reiner's personality. The charming man admired on television was, in private, meticulous in his self-promotion and ruthless in his pursuit of advantage. Van Dyke was never naive. He understood that Hollywood is full of egos. But Reiner's behavior went beyond ambition. It was a consistent pattern of ethical compromise. And that is what fueled Van Dyke's contempt, which he kept largely to himself for decades, speaking only when necessary and observing the consequences of Reiner's choices with a mixture of fascination and frustration. One anecdote that Van Dyke recounted to close friends perfectly illustrates the dynamic. On a project where both men were involved, Reiner had orchestrated a series of meetings to claim credit for creative contributions he did not make. He presented ideas as his own, subtly undermined colleagues' proposals, and charmed decision-makers into agreeing with his vision. Van Dyke, witnessing this, was both incredulous and enraged. He had spent his career respecting craft, collaboration, and fairness. And here was Reiner, effortlessly bending the system for personal gain. It was, in Van Dyke's words, idiocy dressed up as brilliance. But the hatred was not merely professional. It had a personal dimension as well. Van Dyke often reflected on the social dynamics of Hollywood, where charm and image can outweigh integrity. Reiner's ability to navigate these dynamics irritated Van Dyke because it highlighted the disparity between skill and character. Talent alone should not be the measure of respect. And when someone like Reiner achieves immense success while routinely violating principles Van Dyke held dear, it evokes a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and contempt. That combination fermented over years into the kind of enduring hatred that Van Dyke finally felt free to express openly at 100. What makes this revelation so gripping is the timing. Van Dyke speaks after a lifetime of observation, after decades of restraint, and in the shadow of a shocking real-life tragedy involving the Reiner family. The public sees only headlines about the murder of Rob Reiner's parents, Nick Reiner's arrest, and the ensuing media frenzy. But Van Dyke's words add another layer, providing insight into a personality that may have influenced not only professional circles, but personal ones as well. His contempt illuminates a web of interpersonal dynamics, revealing how behavior patterns, ego, and charm interact in ways that can be devastating when left unchecked. There's also an element of honesty and finality in Van Dyke's declaration. At 100, he no longer needs to maintain diplomacy or manage appearances. He can speak the truth, unfiltered, and that truth is explosive. Calling Reiner a fucking idiot is not just colorful language. It's a judgment rooted in decades of observation, a summation of countless small indignities, manipulations, and ethical compromises that cumulatively define character. It's the verdict of someone who has seen everything, endured everything, and ultimately refuses to participate in the pretense any longer. Van Dyke's hatred also forces the audience to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and power dynamics. How do charm, charisma, and perceived brilliance allow a person to mask deeper flaws? How do colleagues, friends, and family members navigate relationships with someone whose behavior is at once magnetic and corrosive? And perhaps most chillingly, how do these dynamics influence environments in ways that may not be immediately visible, but have profound consequences over time? Consider this. In observing Reiner, Van Dyke saw a man whose ego was carefully cultivated, whose image was meticulously maintained, and whose interactions were strategically calculated. This was not recklessness, it was intent. And while the public adored Reiner for his work, Van Dyke understood the cost of that persona. The subtle manipulations, the ethical shortcuts, the quiet undermining of those around him. In Van Dyke's eyes, the charm was a veneer, and the intelligence was misapplied, resulting in a toxic combination that he had long recognized and resented. And yet, there is an almost tragic aspect to this hatred. Van Dyke does not despise Reiner for personal gain. He despises him for what he represents: the misuse of talent, the corruption of integrity, the celebration of image over substance. It is a principled hatred, informed by decades of experience, observation, and reflection. And now, in the wake of family tragedy and public scrutiny, it resonates with even greater force. The world sees the headlines. Van Dyke sees the pattern, and in that pattern lies both revelation and warning. The culmination of this hatred is not simply a colorful insult or a shocking quote. It is a lens through which we can examine Hollywood, family dynamics, and human behavior. It allows us to see that brilliance is not synonymous with virtue, that charm can conceal cruelty, and that long-standing resentment often has its roots in consistent, observable patterns of behavior. Van Dyke's statement is not casual. It is diagnostic, analytical, and profound. But even as Van Dyke articulates his contempt, there is more to uncover: moments of tension, specific incidents, and interactions that reveal exactly why his hatred grew so intense. There are stories from sets, from social events, from industry gatherings, that illustrate the mechanics of Reiner's behavior and the reasons Van Dyke finally spoke out. These stories are not just anecdotes. They are case studies in personality, power, and consequence. And what happened next, the events that would crystallize Van Dyke's hatred into a public declaration, are both surprising and revealing. Because when personal contempt intersects with professional observation, the results are explosive. And the revelations that follow will show not only why Van Dyke hated Reiner, but also how that animosity reflected larger truths about human behavior, fame, and the consequences of unchecked ego. When most people think of the Reiner family, they picture a Hollywood dynasty filled with charm, success, and carefully curated public appearances. Rob Reiner, the celebrated director. Michelle, his elegant and poised wife. Their children, each navigating the spotlight in their own way. On paper, it was a picture-perfect family. But as insiders and investigators have since revealed, the truth was far more complicated. Layers of secrecy, tension, and unspoken conflict lurking beneath the surface. And, as Dick Van Dyke's observations about Rob Reiner make clear, these hidden dynamics were not limited to Hollywood sets or boardrooms. They extended deep into the family home, shaping behaviors, influencing decisions, and, ultimately, contributing to tragedy. The first thing to understand about the Reiners is the way they maintained appearances. Publicly, they projected stability, success, and unity. Media photographs of smiling family gatherings, well-crafted interviews, and glamorous red carpet moments reinforced this perception. But behind closed doors, the story was different. Friends and former colleagues describe a household governed by high expectations, hidden resentments, and subtle manipulations. It was the kind of environment where love and loyalty were often intertwined with control and fear, where family members could never be sure if affection was genuine or calculated. Nick Reiner, the son at the center of the recent tragedy, is particularly emblematic of these dynamics. Reports suggest that Nick struggled with mental health challenges, and while family support existed, it was complicated by the family's intricate web of expectations, image management, and unspoken rules. Romy, the daughter who discovered the bodies, reportedly alerted police to a dangerous family member, indicating that she had been aware of risk factors long before the events of that night. These details hint at a family under pressure, where private tensions simmered beneath the surface of public perfection. Dick Van Dyke's insights into Rob Reiner's personality provide another layer of understanding. Van Dyke saw Reiner as charismatic yet controlling, charming yet calculating. These traits, while navigated with finesse in professional contexts, can be much more destabilizing in private. A controlling personality that is tolerated in Hollywood can become suffocating in a family setting, especially when combined with high expectations, secrecy, and emotional volatility. Van Dyke's critique of Reiner as manipulative and self-serving resonates with the reports emerging about the Reiner household, suggesting that the father's personality may have played a role in shaping a climate of tension and unpredictability. The family's secrets were subtle but pervasive. There were rumors of disagreements over finances, disputes about career choices, and clashes over public image versus private identity. Tracy Reiner, another key family member, has been implicated in reports as someone who may have manipulated situations for personal advantage, including leveraging knowledge of Nick's mental health for strategic purposes. These are serious allegations, and while investigations are ongoing, they underscore the broader picture. A family where influence, control, and image were as important as affection and trust. Moreover, the intersection of personality and privilege is critical. The Reiners lived in a $13.5 million Brentwood estate, a location emblematic of both wealth and isolation. Within this context, conflicts can become magnified. When resources, reputation, and public perception are all at stake, disagreements are rarely simple. Decisions are influenced not only by emotions, but also by strategy, optics, and fear of scandal. Van Dyke, in his observations of Reiner, often noted this strategic calculation, the subtle ways in which Reiner weighed public perception against personal gain. Extrapolate that to family life, and it is not difficult to imagine an environment where tension, secrecy, and underlying resentment become constant companions. The role of the children in this dynamic is also essential. Nick, at 32, had lived in the guest house for some time. Romy, 27, reportedly knew enough to raise concerns about potential danger. Tracy, older and more experienced, appears to have been navigating her own position within the family's intricate social and emotional network. Each member had to balance love, loyalty, fear, and ambition, an almost impossible juggling act, especially when private struggles collided with family expectations. One of the most chilling aspects of these family secrets is how ordinary they might have seemed at first glance. Dysfunction often hides in plain sight. Arguments that seem typical to outsiders may be symptomatic of deeper patterns. Small manipulations, subtle exclusions, or understated power plays can accumulate over time, creating a volatile environment. In the case of the Reiners, the stakes were compounded by wealth, fame, and public scrutiny, creating a pressure cooker in which small fissures could expand into catastrophic fractures. Van Dyke's perspective sheds light on the psychological landscape. He understood Reiner's personality deeply, recognizing tendencies toward control, influence, and strategic manipulation. These traits, when applied in professional contexts, might have seemed like savvy maneuvering. Applied within the family, they could, and perhaps did, create stress, fear, and instability. Van Dyke observed that charm can mask flaws, that brilliance can obscure arrogance, and that public approval can hide private harm. The Reiner household, by all accounts, reflected this paradox. Romy's decision to notify police about a dangerous family member suggests that she had been aware of risk long before the fatal events. It highlights a tragic reality. Awareness does not always translate to prevention, especially in a family system marked by secrecy, complexity, and deep emotional entanglement. Each family member was enmeshed in roles, expectations, and patterns that were difficult to navigate, let alone change. And in this intricate web, even small decisions could have unintended, devastating consequences. The Brentwood estate itself becomes a symbol in this story. Expensive, secluded, and highly private, it provided both comfort and isolation. Within these walls, dynamics could go unnoticed by the outside world. The combination of wealth and privacy can amplify both positive and negative behaviors. In the Reiner case, the house was not just a home. It was a stage on which decades of familial tension, unspoken resentment, and private struggle played out, culminating in a tragedy that no one could ignore. Van Dyke's observations intersect with these family dynamics in a revealing way. His insight into Reiner's controlling tendencies, his manipulative charm, and his prioritization of image over integrity offers a lens through which to understand the household's hidden tensions. The same personality traits that frustrated colleagues and co-stars may have influenced family members' behavior, exacerbated stress, and contributed to conflict. This is not speculation. It's a psychological pattern Van Dyke observed repeatedly in professional contexts, and its application to family life is both logical and illuminating. Moreover, the secrecy itself becomes a character in this story. Secrets about behavior, health, influence, and loyalty accumulate quietly, shaping perception and guiding decisions. In the Reiner household, these secrets, combined with fame, wealth, and expectation, formed a pressure cooker. The family's outward appearance of harmony was a thin veneer, one that could not withstand the weight of private tension and unspoken conflicts. When Romy discovered the tragedy, it was the ultimate exposure of those hidden dynamics, a moment where private realities collided violently with public perception. Finally, the intersection of Hollywood persona and family reality is crucial. Rob Reiner's public charm, intelligence, and success may have influenced not just professional colleagues, but also the family environment. Van Dyke observed these traits professionally and found them objectionable. In private, they may have been even more consequential. The same strategic thinking, the same charm, the same calculated influence that shaped careers also shaped family interactions, decisions, and ultimately, the environment in which tragedy could occur. And as we dig deeper into these family secrets, one chilling question emerges. What would it take for a household like this to reach a breaking point? When do charm, control, secrecy, and tension collide in ways that cannot be contained? The Reiner family's story, tragic as it is, offers a disturbing answer. The cracks were there for years, hidden behind smiles, appearances, and public perception. And on that fateful night, the consequences of those cracks became horrifyingly clear. The night of July 21st, 2025, started like any other in Brentwood, or at least, it appeared that way to outsiders. The Los Angeles sun had long set, leaving the Reiner estate bathed in the soft glow of security lights, a fortress of wealth and privacy. Inside, however, the veneer of calm masked a tension that had been building for years. What would unfold that night would shock the world, shatter perceptions of a Hollywood dynasty, and reveal the terrifying consequences of a family entangled in secrecy, mental health struggles, and unchecked personality dynamics. According to reports, Romy Reiner, 27, was the first to discover the horrific scene. She had gone to check on her parents, Rob Reiner's father, 78, and Michelle, 70, and instead found them brutally stabbed in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. The sight was devastating, unimaginable. Blood, chaos, and silence replaced the carefully curated image of a happy, prosperous family. Romy reportedly contacted authorities immediately, emphasizing that a dangerous family member should be considered a suspect. The suspicion, horrifying as it was based on her prior awareness of potential risk, an awareness born from years of observing tension, erratic behavior, and possibly manipulations within the household. Nick Reiner, 32, the son living in the guest house on the property, was quickly identified as a suspect and arrested the same night. First-degree murder charges followed, and the media immediately seized the story. Headlines splashed the names Reiner and Brentwood across screens and papers, emphasizing wealth, fame, and tragedy. But the sensational coverage only scratches the surface. To truly understand what happened, we must examine the forces at play. Personality, family dynamics, mental health, and privilege, all intersecting in a way that became catastrophic. Inside the estate, investigators would later describe a scene of chaos tempered by meticulousness. Despite the violence, certain patterns were noticeable. Objects left in specific places, no signs of a struggle in certain rooms, and evidence suggesting a sequence of events that is still being pieced together. The meticulousness hints at a disturbing clarity in the actions taken, an intentionality that underscores both planning and emotional intensity. In other words, this was not a random act, but a deeply charged event, rooted in long-standing dynamics within the family. Van Dyke's perspective on Rob Reiner provides critical context for understanding the family environment that night. Van Dyke had long observed Reiner's personality, the charm masking control, the intelligence paired with manipulation, and the tendency to prioritize image over substance. In private, these traits can create environments of tension and fear. Family members may feel pressured to perform, to navigate subtle power plays, or to conceal truths to maintain harmony or avoid conflict. Over time, such an environment can exacerbate mental health struggles and intensify resentment, especially among younger family members trying to establish independence or assert boundaries. Nick Reiner's mental state, reportedly known to other family members, adds another layer of complexity. Managing mental health challenges in any household is difficult when combined with wealth, privilege, fame, and complex family dynamics. It becomes exponentially harder. Reports suggest that Tracy Reiner may have leveraged Nick's mental health knowledge for personal advantage, a detail that underscores the toxic interplay of power, influence, and secrecy. Within this environment, tensions that might be manageable in another household become volatile, creating conditions in which a single triggering event could escalate into unimaginable violence. Romy's role that night is equally significant. She discovered the bodies and immediately recognized the danger, indicating situational awareness shaped by experience within the household. Her actions, contacting authorities, describing a dangerous family member, reflect both courage and foresight. Yet they also reveal the frightening reality that this tragedy was not entirely unpredictable. Patterns had emerged over years, warning signs that, in hindsight, foreshadowed the catastrophic events of that night. The Reiner estate itself played a role in the tragedy. Its size, seclusion, and privacy provided both comfort and isolation. While the estate offered security from outsiders, it also allowed conflicts to intensify behind closed doors. In environments like this, without external checks or interventions, private tensions can escalate unchecked, leading to outcomes that are both tragic and shocking. Wealth and isolation can magnify existing dynamics, turning minor disputes into crises and hidden resentments into catastrophic actions. In examining the night's events, we must also consider the psychological implications. Acts of extreme violence within families often have complex roots, intersecting personality, stress, mental health, and learned behavioral patterns. Van Dyke's observations about Rob Reiner's controlling tendencies and manipulative charm provide a lens through which to understand the possible influence of family environment on Nick's actions. While no statement absolves responsibility, the environment in which these events occurred cannot be ignored. Patterns of control, secrecy, and tension can influence behavior in ways that are subtle yet profound, building toward moments of crisis. The media coverage, as expected, focused on wealth, fame, and the sensational aspects of the murder. Yet, the deeper story, the dynamics that led to this night, is what reveals the tragedy's true scale. Family secrets, personality clashes, unspoken resentments, and mental health challenges all coalesced into a night of horror that none of the public could have predicted. Headlines may shock, but understanding the context terrifies. It's a reminder that behind even the most glamorous facades can lie darkness, tension, and unresolved conflict. Van Dyke's earlier statement about Reiner takes on a new dimension in this context. His observations of charm masking control, of intelligence paired with ego, now provide insight into the family environment in which tragedy unfolded. The patterns he noted professionally may have been echoed privately, subtly influencing behavior, shaping relationships, and contributing to an atmosphere of tension and volatility. In other words, the same personality traits that frustrated Van Dyke for decades may have played a role in shaping events that night. And yet, even as we examine the night of horror, one question looms over everything. How did this culmination happen? How did patterns of control, tension, and secrecy intersect with mental health struggles and family dynamics to produce such a catastrophic outcome? Understanding this requires delving into the weeks, months, and years leading up to that night. The interactions, the decisions, the warnings, and the subtle escalations that ultimately made tragedy inevitable. Nick Reiner, 32, lived much of his life in the shadow of fame, wealth, and expectation. Born into the Reiner family, he had access to privilege and opportunity few could imagine. a sprawling guest house on a $13.5 million Brentwood estate, proximity to Hollywood icons, and a family legacy tied to some of the most recognized names in entertainment. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a dream life. But for Nick, the story was far more complicated, shaped by pressure, scrutiny, and personal struggle, a complex web that ultimately played a central role in the tragedy that would shock the world. Nick's upbringing was marked by contrasts: love and expectation, protection and control, public admiration and private tension. His parents, Rob Reiner and Michelle, were prominent figures whose public lives demanded perfection. Family appearances, media coverage, and social obligations created an environment in which Nick was constantly measured against ideals that were not only unrealistic but emotionally taxing. And while some families navigate fame with relative ease, the Reiners' household was rife with subtle power dynamics, secrets, and high-stakes expectations that left lasting effects. Mental health challenges reportedly affected Nick for years. Sources indicate that family members, including his sister Romy and possibly Tracy, were aware of these struggles. While awareness can be a protective factor in the Reiner household, it appears that knowledge was at times leveraged strategically, creating additional tension. Instead of fostering open support, the family dynamic combined with privilege, expectation, and secrecy may have intensified stress, making it difficult for Nick to navigate daily life without pressure and scrutiny. Those closest to Nick describe him as intelligent and sensitive, yet increasingly isolated. Living in the guest house, separated physically from his parents, yet still under the influence of family dynamics, created a complicated situation. He had freedom, yes, but also a sense of constant observation. Every action, every word, potentially judged, interpreted, or leveraged. Isolation and pressure are a dangerous combination, particularly when coupled with existing mental health struggles and an environment where control and manipulation are normalized. Nick's relationship with his parents was reportedly complex. Michelle and Rob, both highly influential figures in their own right, maintained expectations that may have been difficult to meet. Observers suggest that control, combined with a focus on image and reputation, created an atmosphere in which Nick's autonomy was constrained. Choices that may have seemed minor in other families, decisions about career, lifestyle, or social interaction, were magnified under the weight of familial pressure. Over time, this dynamic could contribute to a sense of frustration, isolation, and emotional volatility. The day of the tragedy is a painful focal point, but the narrative must be contextualized by years of accumulated tension. Investigators have reported that Nick had access to the family estate, lived close enough to interact regularly, and may have had ongoing disputes with family members. While no one outside the household can fully understand the private interactions, patterns are emerging. A combination of personality, environment, and mental health challenges converging into a volatile scenario. It's also important to consider the influence of other family members. Romy's awareness of danger, Tracy's strategic behavior, and the broader family dynamics created a complex social web. Within this web, Nick's actions were both influenced and constrained by relationships that may have been manipulative, conditional, or fraught with tension. The interplay of these forces is critical in understanding not just the events of the night, but the emotional and psychological pressures that may have contributed to the tragedy. Dick Van Dyke's critique of Rob Reiner provides additional insight. Traits that Van Dyke observed professionally, control, manipulation, charm used strategically, likely mirrored family dynamics. In other words, the same tendencies that frustrated Van Dyke in Hollywood may have manifested within the household, influencing Nick's experience. Control, expectation, and subtle psychological pressure can have profound effects, particularly when combined with pre-existing vulnerabilities. Nick's isolation in the guest house was both physical and symbolic. It represented a separation from parental oversight, while simultaneously reinforcing emotional distance. In families where mental health challenges exist, isolation can exacerbate stress, anxiety, and feelings of inadequacy. The Reiner estate, with its size and seclusion, provided the perfect environment for both freedom and containment, freedom to act, but containment by invisible expectations and psychological pressures. The tragic outcome is a stark reminder of how environment, personality, and mental health intersect. While individual responsibility remains central, understanding the contributing factors requires examining the pressures, tensions, and dynamics that shaped Nick's life. Wealth and privilege do not immunize against psychological distress. In fact, they can magnify consequences when compounded by secrecy, control, and high expectations. Nick Reiner's story is not just about the night of the tragedy. It is about a life lived under observation, judgment, and complex interpersonal dynamics. It's about a son navigating fame, mental health, and family expectations in an environment where charm, control, and influence dictated the rules. His actions, shocking as they are, emerge from a context that includes pressure, isolation, and accumulated tension, an environment no one else may have fully understood. And yet, as investigators dig deeper, more questions emerge. How did patterns of family control influence his state of mind? Were warnings ignored, misinterpreted, or leveraged for other purposes? How did the dynamics of fame and image interact with mental health challenges to create a volatile situation? These questions are not abstract. They point directly to the underlying mechanisms that transformed a household into a scene of horror. But perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the Reiner family, despite wealth, fame, and access to resources, was not immune to dysfunction, secrecy, and tragedy. Nick Reiner's actions, horrifying as they were shaped by decades of environment, tension, and influence. And as we continue to explore the story, the connections between personality, privilege,